Welcome, 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 everybody. I'll just give you a few minutes to make sure we get everybody joined. I'm Dareth Morrissey with the Orange County chapter of the American Cetacean Society, here with Kendra and Hannah, two of our board members, and our distinguished speaker this evening, who's been in whale and water world for over 45 years, who's zooming in. Thank you very much, Professor Williamson, Michael, from the East Coast, where it's 10 o'clock his time, and telling us everything we need to know about the North Atlantic right whale, and starting off with some of his current research projects or projects that he's been involved with since not the beginning of time, but close to it. So I don't want to take up any more time. You're going to kind of explain yourself and your history, and we've got your bio and our talk. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael.
All righty. Well, good evening. Thanks for spending your time with us. I'm obviously Michael Williamson. I've been in whale research since 1976. So I've put in my time. But in 1992, I guess, I started WhaleNet, which is the logo on the left there. And that was funded by the National Science Foundation. And that's when the internet was starting. So we raked in a bunch of awards and were able to exhibit in the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History and the US Pavilion, which are probably two of our hallmarks. And then in the midst of this, in 1980 or so, my friend Richard Sears and I started the Mingan Island Cetacean Study, which is now the world's longest running blue whale research program in the world. So we've been sort of on the cutting edge of research in different times and managed to stay sane a little bit. But as we go through this, I'm going to be talking mostly on the North Atlantic right whale and the situation they're in. They're one of the most endangered species now. All the existing whales, they believe, have come from as few as 5 breeding females. They were heavily whaled and hunted. But they're running into problems again, and I'm going to cover some research techniques that we use, which you probably all know about, given this audience. But most of the lectures I give, this is all new news. But we'll start ahead, and I guess if you type in your questions, I'll try to address them, or we'll wait to the end for the Q&A. But I work with the New England Aquarium on a sort of a passive mode. Scott Krause, the director of research, used to be on my board when I had NSF funds for WhaleNet. So we're old friends from long ago. But the right whales used to, enter Mass Bay about the first of, in April or so. And then by the 1st of May, they would venture north up to Bay of Fundy or Browns Bank. But that has all changed, as you'll hear about as we go through this and look at the impacts of climate change. But in the whale species common in the North Atlantic, the mysticetes, we have the minke whales, the right whales, humpbacks, fins, and blues. The minke, the humpback, and the fin are the primary whales of the whale watching in Massachusetts and New England. Very rarely we see a blue whale in Massachusetts Bay, and we try not to get anywhere near right whales because of their status. So as I said, the minke, the humpback, and the fin are the bread and butter for the whale watching industry. And then we have the toothed whales, the harbor porpoises, the various dolphins, pilot whales, killer whales, but these are the ones most commonly seen on the whale watches and so forth. And we have white-beaked dolphins early in the spring, and then they trundle off to wherever they go. But these are the most common whale watching species that we see. But the research methods that we use for the right whale and for other species, it's probably the same, obviously, on both coasts. We have the individual photo identification, which takes the research from a fishery science to a mammalian science, when you can tell associations and return tenacities and habitat use and migratory routes using photographic techniques. And everyone knows that the humpbacks, we use the flukes, the right whales, we use the callosities, dolphins and killer whales, we use dorsal fins and saddle patches. And the blue whale, what we discovered is they're modeled pretty much like a leopard, and they're tiered and they fade from forward, aft. And we've been able to classify and identify some of these whales over 40 years. The pigmentation stays the same. When we were developing our paper, there was one blue whale named Laser. It was just peeling like sheets of wallpaper coming off its body, and we couldn't see any pigmentation. And we're going, oh God, all this work, and it didn't work. But what could have been a total disaster verified our techniques, because a week later we went out and saw her again, and Laser's pigmentation came right back up to the previous markings, even though they had this massive shedding episode. But the North Atlantic right whale, there's so few of them that as soon as we take a picture, we know who it is. The old method here on the left was mapping the callosities that are used to identify individuals, and some of the photographs here on the right. This particular whale, Metomkin, was named after a Coast Guard cutter that was trying to help take the disentanglement team out to disentangle her. And she ended up way offshore going in circles, and she really hasn't been seen. So figure it was fatal. And then we take DNA samples. We use a crossbow and a modified arrow that takes a piece of tissue out about the size of your little, first knuckle, your little finger, or a cigarette butt. And we use the skin for DNA, and we can have the blubber analyzed for, the toxins and what they're eating and so forth. And this, obviously takes time, because we have to send the skin to one lab, we send the blubber to another lab, and it takes months until we get the information back. But we eventually can identify the gender of whales that we're not sure of, because we don't see that many calves. Okay. Now, if you have any friends that like drones, keep them going. I love drones in whale research. You can see so much behavior that you can't see from a deck of a ship. You can see down in the water and see the jockeying for position. You can see the patterns of movement. But a friend of ours at Ocean Alliance went a step further with their drone. They use that, that's Roger Payne's group. I forget what the previous name of the group was, but now it's Ocean Alliance. But they affix petri dishes to the drone and collect whale blow. And of course, whale blow is made from some seawater gets blown up periodically, condensation of the moisture in the air exhaled, and whale snot. Okay, so the mucus is collected on the petri dishes, and that can be analyzed and used to tell the gender, the stress hormones. Sometimes you can tell if they're pregnant. So you can find a great deal of information from the drone collection. And of course, working on the water, those naturalists know that you get a little nuts. So they call that the snot bot, and it takes it back to the snot yacht, and it goes downhill from then. But it's a very effective device for learning about the whales. And then we use satellite tagging. It used to be about $5,000 a shot. Now it's down to about $2,500. We used to put the tags on with the crossbow, which made me a little nervous. But now we use a modified paintball gun, but the crossbow is $300. The paintball gun is like $6,000. So there's a trade-off. And this is a satellite tagging event in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The person with the gun is Richard Sears, my research partner, the director of the Mingan Island Cetacean Study. And of course, the arrow separates, and just the tag is left on the whale, and the whales don't really react. Our tags are designed not to pass through the blubber muscle interface, so they get rejected relatively, well, much faster than we wish, but we do get a lot of information. Some have stayed on for a long period of time, and as it turns out, the ones that stayed on long enough all came down to the latitude of South Carolina off the continental shelf, and no one knows where they calve in the Atlantic. So that might be the calving area. They might go into the Gulf Stream and calve and then venture back into the feeding grounds. But here's your satellite tag on the whale. It also gives you a good indication of the pigmentation. It's sort of like a Monet painting gone marine. But the tag is about half the size of a cell phone. And it still boggles my mind that you can have 2 AA batteries in there, and that'll transmit a signal to a satellite, and it'll run 6 to 9 months. My flashlight doesn't run 6 to 9 days with the 2 A's. Oh, I just wanted to see up here on the dorsal fin. I don't know if you can see my mouse clicker, but looks like could be some orca scars grabbing hold. Strange pattern. But we're going to talk about the right whales. And the right whales here are strange looking beasts. They have the large callosities on their head, pretty much where we have hair, a big high arcing mouth. And it's a very high arc because of the amount of baleen that they have in their mouth. And these are the callosities that we use to photo identify all the right whales. And they're called the right whale because they were the right whale to kill. They swim very close to land. Sometimes this is taken in Western Australia, but sometimes you can get closer to the whales on the beach than you can from the research vessel. And you go out of the river 5 minutes and you're with cows and calves. It's not a very hard job to find them. They also float when they die. Most of the Balaenopterus will sink. And so the right whales, as said, on the east coast of the United States, were decimated to a point where all the whales now, they believe, come from about 5 breeding females. But they, being close to land, being slow, floating when they die, it's the perfect whale for whaling. Then you have the thick blubber, you have the baleen. They were the first ones to go. All the whales that sink were safe until the Industrial Revolution, when they had steam engines and compressed air that they can use to keep them afloat to get them to the factory ships or the land stations. And the baleen is very long, and they're open in the front like a pup tent, so they can feed continually. They can just plow through the water, collecting baleen, which adheres to the inside of the baleen like jelly, and then they cleanse it once in a while with their tongue. But the question I have, and people were puzzled, how do they know when to open their mouth? Because there's a critical density where they can get more calories than they expend. And somehow they know how. And you can see the baleen plates. Excuse me. I'm a little. There's pollen down here in Hilton Head 12 months a year. You can't dodge it. But anyway, you can see all the baleen plates, and that's what they were after, actually. Baleen was the pre-plastic, before we had plastics. A lot of the implements were made out of baleen. When the baleen's in the whale's mouth, it's sort of rubbery and flexible. And when it's out of the whale's mouth, as you can see on the right side, when it's dried, it takes on a plastic characteristic. And they use it for buttons and corset stays and cooking implements. And the baleen from one right whale would pay for the whole whaling voyage. So at times they would take just the baleen and let the carcass float away, because that would take 2 or 3 days to try the blubber, but they could get the baleen out in a few hours. And so a lot of, aside from normal death of the whale, a lot of the whales were wasted, not even for oil, because they could just take the baleen. And then they, have a lot of blubber for oil. The bowhead in the right whale could be a foot thick. And this is obviously a ship impact. But the cow-calf pairs, the calves have the callosities, so you can photograph them and get a good leg up on the new population. Excuse me. In the anatomy, the big arcing lower jaw, the baleen hang from the upper jaw. Like all balenopterids are all mysticetes. They have a convex upper jaw to hang the baleen, versus the toothed whales that have concave upper jaw for reflecting the sound. The flippers are big square paddles, basically. And the right whales break the rule, where baleen whales have 4 fingers in the flipper. Toothed whales have 5 digits in the flipper, but a right whale, for some reason, is a baleen whale with 5 fingers. In the anatomy, it's pretty much like every other whale. They have all the same bones as we have, with the exception of the legs, and they just have the remnant pelvic bones embedded in the flesh here. But the lower jaw of a baleen whale is solid, like a tree trunk, as opposed to a toothed whale, where the lower jaw is basically a hollow oil field, and they have totally different functions with the whale. Now, how large is a right whale? Here's a comparison with a diver. They're 50 feet, more or less, fully grown, 50 plus tons. Now, on the East Coast, the critical habitats up in New England was the primary feeding area in the Bay of Fundy and Browns Bank out in here. This is the primary feeding area, and they would migrate down the East Coast and start calving in South Carolina and Georgia. But the biggest calving area is right here off the Florida-Georgia border. And unfortunately, there's a submarine base in the same location. So they're always dredging. And there's always ship traffic. And in Savannah, Georgia, is one of the largest container ports So there's shipping coming in and out. So it's like playing soccer in the nursery. It doesn't work well. Fortunately, this year we've only lost one calf to a collision. Now, because of the temperature changes in the water, in 2017, we started seeing right whales up in our research area in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And I think we've seen maybe a dozen right whales in the first 35 to 40 years in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And in 2017 and beyond, at least 40% of the population of right whales is feeding in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Big change in location. And so feeding is a continual thing. It's not like lunge feeding, like most baleen whales, or feeding on individuals like toothed whales. They're straining as they go. It's a continual process. When you're eating something that's small, I guess you have to eat all the time. And breeding, right whales have the largest testes on the world, upwards of a ton. When they're breeding, we call it a washing machine. It's just frothing water and body parts appearing and disappearing. And I think in one episode in the Bay of Fundy, there were 37 males trying to breed with one female. And with the right whales, the genders aren't divided 50-50. Of the 350 estimated right whales in the Western North Atlantic, only 70 are breeding females. So somewhere along the line, something happened. No one knows what. But calving is very important when your population's that small. Every calf is extremely important, and every female is more important than every male because they breed and they have the calves. But as you can see, we only have 19 calves in 2021, 15 in 21, 22, 12 so far this year, and fortunately only one has been found deceased on the beach. So hopefully it'll be a successful year in having a low mortality rate. But we had a real change in population. It remained relatively low for years. And then in 2000, it started to increase all the way up until about 2010 or 2012. Now, what happened in 2000 was the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, or the sewage treatment plant that used to pump the sewage effluent out in the harbor mouth, built a 9-mile tunnel to disperse the effluent out in the Mass Bay. And of course, everyone was concerned. But what seemed to have happened is the effluent fertilized the bay, and Stormy Mayo studied the plankton and noted that there was a calf bloom 2 years after there was a plankton bloom. So after they started pumping the effluent out, the population sort of climbed and maxed out in their calving rate each year. And then about 2012, it leveled off, and then it started to fall again. 2017 had a huge mortality rate. And believe this is caused by climate change. The benefits of the fertilizing, we'll call it, lost its effect because the whales and the plankton were affected by the temperature change. So the plankton was farther north. There still is feeding in the early spring in Mass Bay, but the whales move out and travel farther north than they used to, up to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And then in 2017, there were 40 some odd right whales killed, mostly by entanglements in new fishing gear in Canada. They have different fishing gear, different techniques. And I guess the whales weren't aware of the change and had a very disastrous 2017. And now there's estimated about 350 left in 2023, down from a high of like 481. And you can see the calving per year fluctuates greatly, probably dependent on the plankton blooms. And you have this very low calving rate in 2017, probably because they had to swim farther and found less food. So they had fewer calves. But you can see the fluctuation. And another problem is the critical habitats where they probably calved are all industrialized. And so they're left with coastal area off South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. Like the gray whales on the West Coast, no other whale feeds the way they do. So they had their food source, and it seems like the climate is affecting them also. But they had their nurseries, they had the lagoons in Mexico. So they were able to rebound, was it 3 times from overhunting, when right whales didn't have that advantage. So many things eat plankton, and they lost most of their nurseries. So it was a lose-lose for them. The arrow is pointing to Hilton Head, and I do this lecture a lot in the area to educate people about the right whales. And most of them, a lot of people, about 2/3 of people don't even know the whales are out there. But this is the critical area, Fernandina Beach, Jacksonville, Brunswick, Georgia. And this is where most of the calving and the nurseries are. But here you can see the transects of all the research locating the calves off Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, a little bit of North Carolina. But and all these sightings now, there's a site. I think if you Google whale map, it'll take you to a site and you can see the current sightings, where they are, how many. You can go back and select dates and find out how many were where, when. So that they're very highly researched animals, trying to slow shipping down, divert shipping, trying to develop vertical ropeless fishing gear to minimize entanglements. And yeah, the shipping lanes are critical. You can see all these black lines are very busy shipping lanes right in the nursery. But the whales themselves in their migration, they changed the icon for the whale from a fluke to a dot, for you can see, for clarity's sake. But these are all the sightings up until 1971. You can see almost nothing up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Up in here, in the Bay of Fundy, sticking down here, Nova Scotia. Mass Bay is buried in here in Cape Cod. But this was the habitat for the right whales. And in 2017, you can see the movement of the right whales up to the Gaspé Peninsula, and up here, these couple up here right by the research station. And you have fewer animals in the Massachusetts Bay. In the arm of Cape Cod is still a big feeding area early on in the season, but very few animals are in the Bay of Fundy or on Browns Bank. And like I said, at least 40% of the right whales are now using the Gulf of St. Lawrence for a feeding area. And what happened? You know, why did this change? This shows the temperature anomalies. This is somewhat misleading because the anomaly is the same in a lot of areas, and that's more than 5 degrees. But, but the temperature in the Gulf of Maine started out warmer than the temperature in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So the increase in temperature in the Gulf of St. Lawrence is probably where this temperature was for the copepods. And so this is a sort of a complicated thing to explain to people. But the anomaly is the same, but the base temperature is different. And plankton says undergoing a global migration. They're very temperature sensitive, most of them, so they have to go where the temperature is correct for their, you know, development and livelihood. And so they go where they need to go, and then the whales have to find them. And the blue whales moved, you know, from their normal habitat to where we've been researching them for, you know, almost 40 years. And now they're gone. We still haven't found where they're concentrating, where the food is. But this is a typical plankton toe. These are the copepods, the big ones. Well, big ones, a couple of them will fit on the period at the end of your sentence. And you have dinoflagellates. And if you're a teacher, this is something that I use with my Australian class, as we only had 4 field microscopes, but we had 20 girls. So, and all of them had a cell phone, had an iPhone. So we had them take a picture through the eyepiece of the plankton sample. Then they could sketch them and ID them without having to wait their turn for the microscope. It was much more effective, and some of the creative ones were able to colorize the different ones that they were looking at and blow them up, and it was an amazing experience developing the techniques from necessity, because everyone had a cell phone, but we only had 4 field microscopes for 20 people. And here's your typical food for a right whale. It's like you running down the street, sucking in dust, you know, and hope you get something nutritious. But the right whales feed on a trophic level lower than most of the other whales. They feed on the same level as herring and sand lance and other plankton feeders. And you have your diatoms, your plants, you know, the base of the food chain, and which feeds the zooplankton, in this case represented by copepods. And copepods are eaten by fish with gill rakers, whale sharks, whatever, and right whales and bowheads. And then all the other whales are at trophic level above. So the right whales are more efficient biologically and ecologically, because they're on a lower level feeding than the trophic levels. But the mortalities, like I said, there's fewer than 350 now, down from 481 at their height. We have only 70 breeding females that we know of. Some are probably too young, and some are probably too old. But we had an interesting happening. Someone was able to ID a right whale from an old Boston Herald to a current photograph of a right whale. And so the female was at least 65 years old, and she had a calf. That's could be good news, but we don't know if that is the norm or an anomaly. But it was identified a 65-year-old mom with a calf. And it's now believed instead of 17 whales, 42 whales died in 2017, which is a big change from the Massachusetts Bay of Fundy area to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And it was disastrous in the Canadian waters. And the latest population estimates include 7 calves in 2019, 10 in 2020. It said, and we have 12 this year with only 1 mortality so far. And this shows the mortality through the years. Blue is United States, red is Canadian, and 2017 was the disastrous year of 17 known to, and examined, but we believe that 42 actually died that were never hit the shore and were never really discovered. And we have data that says that at least 86% of identified right whales have been entangled 1 or more times in fishing gear. We tell that by the different scarring patterns and rope burns on the flippers and the rostrum and the flukes. So that shows that pretty much all of them have difficulty with all the lobster gears and long lines and gill nets and everything else that have vertical lines with buoys, which is the problem. And the right whales are once again in decline. A lot of the researchers, Stormy Mayo, Scott Krause, etc., don't want them to go extinct on their watch, so to speak. So they're working very hard to try to eliminate the cause and effect of entanglements and ship strikes. Ship strikes are pretty obvious when they're large vessels. They are low visibility animals. They have no dorsal fin. They're barely above the water. They're slow. It's been discovered that ships basically have a cone of silence in front of them. The noise that they make is about 30 degrees left and right of the bow, then midships, and then behind. But in front, there's very little noise to let these slow swimming critters get out of the way. And we have pretty much any researched, chronicled, and so forth. But after the dead, they're no longer part of the population, which is the problem. In Massachusetts, they did something that seems pretty simple. The Stellwagen Bank goes from Provincetown to Gloucester, which is the primary feeding area. The right whales feed primarily down in here in Cape Cod Bay because the current is counterclockwise and Mother Nature brings all the plankton down and concentrates it in here from all of this area out around here. And so that's the end of the conveyor belt, so to speak. And they're down here feeding early on April, and then May, they usually go off. But what they did in Boston, there's a shipping lane used to come in on a diagonal. And so to minimize the shipping traffic in the feeding areas, they brought the shipping channel up and went more perpendicular to Stellwagen Bank to minimize the length of time the ships are on the bank. And they also put in a series of hydrophones that when they hear a whale, they send out a notice to the shipping of the locations of the whales that verbalized something, and the hydrophones picked it up. They're putting in some down here in the southern end of the migration, but it's more of still of a test. It's not as elaborate as it is in Massachusetts Bay. And the entanglements, they whales swim into it. It's like getting dental floss stuck between your teeth, and they put a bowling ball on each end of the floss, and you can't use your hands to get it out. But you get scarring, you get rope burns in the rostrum. You have them basically dragging this gear and not being able to feed effectively, so that affects the calving rates and the well-being of the whale. And this diagram just depicts the problem with the vertical lines to the surface buoy, to the traps or the nets, and the whales feeding swim through it, and then they get entangled. This is a humpback entanglement. In 1984, this is probably the only picture I'm in with a whale. I'm driving the boat. This is the very first disentanglement attempt. Much unlike today's, we have no helmets. We have nothing. We don't need any stinking helmets. But we got Ibis loose from the bottom somehow, and then she disappeared. And a month later, she was spotted off Provincetown on Thanksgiving. And by then she was very tired, and they were able to go out and get all the gear off her except the one in her mouth. And the inflatable was pulled right up against her mouth like a dock. And Dave Matillo was pulling on the line, and Ibis wouldn't open her mouth. So he actually said, "God damn it, Ibis," and he punched her in the head, and she opened her mouth, and he pulled the rope out. But the only person I know that's punched out a humpback. But we have similar teams now, fully trained with safety gear and amazing knives and experience, and they're able to disentangle the whales more effectively than we did. It's not a very safe maneuver. In most cases, the whales are spooked. Sometimes they seem to know you're helping them. But every whale you disentangle, especially right whales, especially female right whales, it helps ensure positive results for the population. And on the whale, if you see these pinkish red areas, these are cyamids, and the cyamids are an indicator of the whale's health. When you get a very sick whale, I guess the integrity of the skin is degraded, and the cyanid population just expands exponentially, and they're just cover the whale. And you see a whale covered in cyamids, it's not long for the world. And then when they do beach, as you know, it's like a scientists are like flies. They hit, people studying connective tissue with ultrasound, people taking the larynx to study vocalizations. Tissues are sent to numerous labs, and it takes about a year to really collect all the information unless it's a ship strike or entanglement, to really tell what happened to the whale or what the quality of the whale was. And sometimes you never know. But the recruitment data, as I said, the total population, viable females are very low, around 70. And the total population changes. And this is the year 2000, where you have a big increase in population because of probably because of the effluent going out, because you can see the number of calves before 2000 is relatively small compared to the number of calves after 2000, when they started pumping sludge into the bay. And this just shows that the birth rate doubling from 0.03 to 0.06. pre and post effluent. And this is just a diagram showing the water treatment plant. Oops. And the water being effluent shunted underground and to the surface with these diffuser heads, are like water sprinklers diffusing the effluent and fertilizing the the plankton food chain, basically. And then the right whales, this is in the Western Australia, right whales are the southern population. There are many more right whales, but the North Atlantic population, not having a nursery and losing most of its food, are in tough shape. And this is something I built to show the buoyancy control whales have. By compressing their lungs, they can reduce their buoyancy and sink. And if you watch the bubble in here, you can see the bubble changing, which is like the whale's lungs. And the dropper will float or sink depending on the volume of the gas. This was like the Cliff Notes version, and we made it through.
I've heard that most of the entanglements with right whales, they're just so volatile that they actually drug them and anesthetize them a little bit to calm them down.
Yeah. Yeah, we try a lot of different techniques to increase the success rate of the disentanglements.
Okay. I know that they're starting to work on that here on the West Coast too, with mellowing out populations, or maybe even potentially getting the right permits and paperwork in order, which who knows how long that's going to take with the government to euthanize the whales, that are severely emaciated, from entanglements and whatnot. So that's interesting. Let me see if I can see Q&A and chat is open.
Is there maybe try to show you if you can see this? This is the fringe on the right whale baleen, which is extremely long, narrow, and as showing you the comparison with the blue whale, which is very coarse. These feed on krill, which are very large compared to the copepods, so they have finer bristles to filter out the finer animals versus the coarse bristles for larger animals.
That's amazing. Just things you have laying around the house. That's awesome.
Yeah. My kids thought everyone had whales in their basement when they were growing
up. And then Rex has a question. Where was that, or was it in the chat? Now I'm lost. Did the is there a population in the East Atlantic as well?
Excuse me, is there a population
of right whales in the East Atlantic? And did those whalers harvest the meat also, or
well,
was just the
bass whalers wiped them out pretty much early on, and then they came over to Newfoundland and started whaling over here. But every once in a while, a whale will venture over there, but there's no real population to speak of in the eastern.
Kind of like our gray whales on the East Coast, right?
Yeah, like the Atlantic gray whale. Yeah, that isn't.
Right. Yeah, anymore. I think the question went into both spots. How many successful, I just want to ask, how many successful unentanglements have you participated in? Do you have an idea?
Me? No, not many. I worked with Stormy because back then, not many people had experience driving inflatables around whales, and that's all we ever used up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Because in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, when we started, we had 18-foot inflatables with 25 horsepower motors going 20 miles offshore next to 80-foot whales.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So, yeah, now we have 24-foot inflatables with 90 horsepower motors. But I've probably, I don't know, not that many. I've done a lot of necropsies, but Richard and I freed a couple humpbacks up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence the same way, old school, no safety gear, just see what you can do. And Ibis, it just here and there, but I did more necropsies than I did disentanglements.
Wow. And is Ibis still around?
No, she vanished somewhere along the line. I forget what year, whatever. But ironically, she was the first whale I saw the following season.
Wow.
On the whale watches. It's like every boat had a bottle of champagne aboard to see if they could find her.
And is Salt, what's the history with Salt, the humpback that's had?
Oh, Salt has been around forever. I think she's the first whale I ever saw. I used to go out Provincetown with Stormy Mayo and Al Avalar. And Salt and Pepper were hanging out together all the time, probably when they were younger. And Salt has been a very prolific grandmother and mother. And she sort of brings her calves over to the whale watch boats. When she has a new one, she just introduces them to the boat. There you go. But she's still around and she's still productive. And she's, it's always a plus when you go out and see Salt. Of course, most people don't know the history, but Salt's probably the most famous of the humpbacks, at least in Mass Bay and the East Coast.
That's good. That's nice to know that she's still around. Rex has another question or comment. He said there was a recent NOVA show showing the fishermen moving to a method, not using the downline. The net sank and was later dragged up rather than hauled up from surface buoys.
No, what they did, they put an attachment on the end trap. It's like a cap, and they have a sonic signal, and that releases a buoy that comes up to the surface. So the only time there's a vertical line is when they're retrieving their gear. And so it's like sonar. It sends the signal down, the acoustic, signal, and it releases the buoy, and then they pull it up. And one, it's the cost, and two, it's not like Dad did it. They're very traditional fishermen, especially in Maine, very reluctant to change and very reluctant to invest in it because they say, well, their gear never entangled a whale, so why should they change?
Right, so they're not using different color coded. I know we're trying to get people for different fisheries to use different colored ropes, to identify things.
And for a while, they were trying to put a safety brake in the line. So if a whale did come entangled, it would have a weak link, so to speak, and break loose. So the amount of line is entangled would be minimized versus 8 traps and 2 buoys and a couple anchors, so forth. So there's a lot of work being done to try to improve the entanglement problem, but you're bucking tradition and cost, and people just don't want to change. They've done it that way forever. And
right, I was just going down the rabbit hole of information for something, and it was just all the fisheries that were protesting closures, during certain times of the year and migrations, and they just weren't having any of it, and things were opening and closing, and just heated.
Well, yeah, always heated. But years ago, Nova Scotia tried something where they would only allow lobstering 6 months a year. And the lobstermen caught just as many lobsters in 6 months, but they used half the fuel and half the time. And so they started lobster pounds, floating lobster pounds, and they would capture lobsters and feed them and sell them as the market changed. And I don't know if that's still functioning, but it was highly successful at the time. but if you caught just as many lobsters and used half the fuel and spent half the time at sea, you think it might be a win-win. But
yeah, those dots seem to be connected a little bit. Okay.
yeah.
Any other questions for everybody? I'm so sorry. I'm glad now your voice is back and you're fine and you're not coughing.
Yeah.
My brother's in Georgia, and he has to go out with like a respirator mask on, a gas mask, at times because of that pollen. So
I live on DM like M&Ms.
Can you see that question that's in the chat?
What's the projection for the northern right? That's what we're trying to do.
To stop.
Some people have dire projections if things don't change. People are more optimistic that they think if things do change and they can slow shipping down and minimize the entanglements. But like I said, Stormy Mayo and Scott Krause are two primary researchers for the right whale program. They were concerned that the right whale would go extinct, quote, on their watch. And they don't want to see that. They're working very hard to minimize the impact and make change, but change grinds slowly for sure. And in the Western Australia, population's doing very well. I mean, there are 20,000 something southern right whales. That's not just Western Australia. That's Eastern Australia, Western Australia, South America, Africa, because they have the Southern Ocean population. It's an accumulation of what we would have different populations for the Western or Eastern North Atlantic or the Pacific or so forth.
You said 20,000 in the Southern Ocean.
Yeah, something like that. It's a huge number. And like I say, for Southern and Western and Eastern Australia, you're just 5 minutes out of the river and you're on top of right whales. I mean, bang, it's an amazing spot. But
and that's in our winter. When are the months to go there?
Well, I was down there usually in July and August. It's their winter, but it's like winter in South Carolina. It's not winter. It's their winter. Yeah, I was down there with July, August, September. It's a good months. School vacation.
Yeah, it's true. Okay. Any other questions for Michael? Well, I know this is an interesting subject. I learned more information than I knew, which is always fantastic. And I didn't cry that much. So that's always a good thing. But the heart is...
Doing a Zoom, I didn't have all my toys and props and things to show you, but...
Oh, the glasses. Do you have your glasses?
Yeah. This is something I made just so you can see how a whale sees. These are sort of lying in bed readers that I modified. And you put them on, you see nothing in front of you, but you can see out here on the sides. And, I can't imagine having two completely different views out of each eye and no binocular vision.
You should go swimming with those, see how that goes.
Yeah. And this is a satellite tag now.
With those little AA batteries.
Yeah. And this is an old model, like a 1990s model.
Wow.
That's why they call it a mouse tag. It looks like a big mouse. Yeah,
that would hurt me.
It's
crazy. One last question, and lots of thank you. Oh, we've got a couple more. Everybody's saying thank you and goodbye. Is there any lobbying in Congress to protect right whales? Any legislation? What can we do?
Well, there's all kinds of people going to Washington and National Marine Fisheries and NOAA and various groups, and I'm sort of removed from the political aspects. I don't want to drive myself insane, but yeah, they're trying to work through more NOAA and National Marine Fisheries and state governments, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, trying to get the fishing regulations altered for safety reasons for whales. And of course, the fishermen hate it, and conservationists are moving for it, and you get the clash.
Right. Okay. And the northern and southern populations really the same species or different?
No, they're a little different. And I, for one, have a very difficult time finding it. The callosities are supposed to be different a little bit, but yeah, because people have toyed with the idea of capturing some young right whales and bringing them up into the northern population, which is a can of worms you don't want to deal with. But yeah, people come up with some interesting ideas.
Okay.
Yeah, I always thought this is related, but in the early 70s, Charles Jerez saw bubble feeding for the first time in Alaska. And years later, like a half dozen years later, the whales and humpbacks in Mass Bay started doing half circles and V's. And I was thinking, the whales always migrate against each other. But you know, when one comes south, there's always one turns the wrong way. And so he might end up in the southern population saying, hey, this is a cool way to eat. Then they go around and someone makes the wrong turn on South America and it comes up. And the same thing happens. So you have all this information being transmitted by the dumb ones.
It's like idiocracy, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe last question. We see DNA evidence besides callosity, size, or pattern of differentiation.
Yeah, that's how they determined that the population, the present North Atlantic right whale population, was derived from as few as 5 breeding females that were left in the population. So wow. They're all, aside from the entanglements and the collisions, they're inbreeding. I mean, they're all related, you know, distant cousins, but that doesn't help.
No, it works out okay, I guess, for the vaquita, you know, being so isolated, you know, genetically for such a long time. It doesn't seem to cause any banjo playing with that population. But we just don't know long term with right whales because there's so few to even.
Everyone's, you know, people are pessimistic because of the mortality rate, especially 2017 and 18 and so forth. And there's the optimists are thinking we're making headway on fishing gear and ship traffic, and you just have to see what happens.
There's always got to be hope.
Yeah, keep working, turn that corner. Right. And then you add climate change, and the whales are traveling another 1,000 miles to get their food.
Yeah. There's lots of things that
lots of ifs.
Lots of ifs, lots of things to fix.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I know it's late, you know, you've got probably a few more coughs in you, you know, or your Benadryl. What are you on to stay? Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. And thank you so much. I know it's like 11 o'clock there. Past. Yeah. But we appreciate you so much, and we've learned so much, and I'm sure we will have you back next year. I know you've got a whole plethora of different things you could talk about because you're just, you know, a walking encyclopedia of knowledge, and thank you so much for sharing this with us. I really, really appreciate it.
All righty. I enjoyed it. Anytime.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. Say a prayer for the right whales. Okay.
Yep. Take care.
Okay. Good night.